Good evening, gentlemen. Very excited about tonight's class, because in tonight's class, God willing, we start a new chapter. We are on, thank you very much, we are on chapter 7 of the Holy Tanya. Praise God. We are barreling, hurtling, speeding through the text of the Tanya. Right? How did we get to chapter 7? Through a lot of work on all our part, thank God. You know, you got to, as the kids say nowadays, you have to take the W, right? You have to take the W. If you're given the W, if the book says you're up to chapter 7, you have to take it. We're up to chapter 7. We did somehow we've ended up here. We'll save the Vart about Gewalt for the end of Tanya. You know the Vart about Gewalt. It's the very last chapter of Tanya, in the Kuntras Achron. The Alter Rebbe says Gewalt in Yiddish. Right, we read it right before Yitzis Kislev, maybe 1 or 2 days before even. Yeah, right before, next time in Chitas, pay attention, right before Yitzis Kislev, like on Chai Kislev, I think, or maybe 1 or 2 days earlier, we say Gewalt, and the Vart of the Chassidim is that you've read the whole Tanya and look what you still look like, right? Gewalt, right? So, the bit of a sharp Hasidic word. Thank God we're only up to chapter 7, so we know it's not time to judge yet, right? We're still in the middle here of the first part of Tanya. Okay. I'll say the chapter. You tell me what the one word that summarizes and encapsulates the chapter is. I know you love this game. We play it every new chapter. You want him to play. The floor is open to anyone. Shout him out. Chapter 1 of Tanya. What is Nefesh Abahamis, animal soul? Very good. Chapter 2 of Tanya. Chapter 2 of Tanya starts very famously. Nefesh Hashenis b'Yisrael, he chelek. So chapter 2 is about Nefesh Elokis. Chapter 1 is Nefesh Abahamis. Chapter 2 is Nefesh Elokis. Chapter 3, no. Everything's about everything, so that doesn't help. That's chapter 3. Chapter 3 is Koiches, Seichel and Midos, 10 spheres, 10 faculties of the soul. Chapter 4, not only did we go through the chapters, we explained that it's a seder. You can't, if you understand it, you can't forget, because it's a logical progression, right? It's a logical progression. You start with the essence of the soul, then you move outward to the faculties, right? And then you move outward to the levushim, the garments, chapter 4. Levushim or mitzvahs, right, is chapter 4. Chapter 5 is Torah. I'm waiting for everyone to shout out Torah. Chapter 5 is about Torah. Chapter 6, which we just finished, Klippa. Klippa is the answer. Chapter 6 is Klippa. Klippas Nega is going to be chapter 7. Chapter 6 is Klippa, Shalosh Klippas Atmeas, actually, the 3 impure Klippas. Klippa in general, you could say, is chapter 6, okay? So we went through, we had 1 chapter on the animal souls, Ronnie said. Then we had chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5 were all about the godly soul and its various faculties, behaviors, garments, etc. Chapter 6 is a return to the animal soul, where we begin to discuss mostly not the soul. The soul is mentioned almost rather relatively briefly, and we say all of its behaviors, right, when it's involved in not good things, right, its thought, speech, and action are all from the Klippa and Sitra Achra, is what we discussed in chapter 6. Chapter 7 and chapter 8 continue on. So these chapter 6, 7, 8 makes a little trilogy, a little subsection of the Tanya. Just like chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5, you could say were a section, right? You could say 6, 7, and 8, because 6, 7, and 8 are all in different ways, all about the Klippa. They're all about Klippa and Sitra Achra. We are up to chapter 7, the middle chapter of the trilogy. The Empire Strikes Back, right? But what did we discuss in chapter 6? Let's review the main points of chapter 6. You could break down chapter 6 into 2 main points, I think. And they're 2 words. Most of the chapter revolves around defining and explaining the terms Sitra Achra and Klippa, in that order. First Sitra Achra, Then klipa. Sitra achra means the other side. Why do we call this category of things the other side? Because it means not holy. Very good. There's only two sides to the Alter Rebbe. Now, chapter 7 is where we're going to put in the wrinkle, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. But really, it doesn't, what we say in chapter 7, or we're going to say about Klippos Nega, which is the middle category, does not undo what we said in chapter 7. What we said in chapter 7 is still true. There's holiness, and then there's everything else, which is fundamentally true. Everything else has something in common in that it's not holy, whereas holiness is holy. I'm not saying anything profound there, right? Sitra Achra means that to the Alter Rebbe's view, right? Let's go back further in our review to the introduction and the introductory classes and the title page. What's the point of the Tanya? The point of the Tanya is a Jew comes to the Alter Rebbe and says, I want to have a close and holistic relationship with God. I want an authentic, real connection with God in my life. And the Alter Rebbe replies to him with the Tanya. The Tanya is a meeting with the Alter Rebbe. Each person that studies the Tanya is meeting with the Alter Rebbe directly. And the Alter Rebbe is telling you the path to have that real relationship with God. Love and fear, right? Beficho vilvavcha la'asosei, right? Just what you speak it and what's in your heart and what you do should all be one, right? In the service of God. How does a person reach this state? A person reaches this state. Well, the Alter Rebbe hasn't really told us to do anything yet, but even from the Alter Rebbe's categorizing and definitions, which is really most of what Tanya has been so far, right? You can already start to see the outline of the Alter Rebbe's program. And in fact, if you don't understand these definitions, as I keep telling you, if you don't understand these early chapters and the way the Alter Rebbe sees reality, you're not going to be able to follow his instructions, because his instructions rely on a worldview, on a way things are, that is not the intuitive worldview. And in fact, in chapter 8, I keep saying we're going to get to it, but finally in chapter 8, God willing, in the next chapter, we're going to get to the issue of worldviews and understanding things and philosophy itself, right? So it's a self-referential chapter of Tanya, chapter 8. But before that, we have chapter 7. So when the Alter Rebbe says a person wants to have a real relationship with God, what does the Alter Rebbe said about that relationship so far, just with his definitions of the souls? What the Alter Rebbe has said is, number one, as a Jew, you have a relationship with God in what you are. Never mind in what you do. What you do is secondary. What you are is a relationship with God. In fact, you have within you a whole soul that remains holy, that is holy by definition, right? That is fundamentally an expression of God. The Jew, through his Jewish identity, through his immutable membership, right, in the chosen people of God, as an inheritance from his forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has an essential point at which he is attached to God. In chapter 6, we explained what is everything that attaches to God. Everything that attaches to God is bottle, right, is nullified, is nothingness, right? And we explained why that is, because there is no such thing as neutral existence. There is no such thing as it just exists. Now let's examine whether it refers to God or doesn't refer to God. Everything that is a manifestation of godliness. Existence itself is a manifestation of godliness. God precedes existence. Therefore, attachment to God is merely an issue of removing what covers over, removing what is opposed to each thing being fundamentally connected to God. Or to put it a different way, it is finding the true holy nature of each thing. And that brings us to the second definition in chapter 6, which was of klipa, which means the shell and the peel. that which is the other side is also a shell and a peel. What do we mean by that? We mean that that which denies holiness has become a non-expression of God. Because if holiness means an expression of the divine, right? If holiness means the speech of God, if it means God expressed in a different place, God expressed in a context, right? Then that which says, I am, that which perceives itself to not be an expression, but rather an independent thing, right? Covers over not just God, it covers over its own true identity, right? Like we said in the metaphor of the banana and the peel, right? And like we said in the metaphor of the cliche, which we discussed when a lot of people weren't here, right? You may have heard it on the stream. We discussed the metaphor of the cliche, how when something is used, when a phrase is used so many times, it ceases to seem like an expression of any soul, right? It becomes its own individual thing. It becomes an expression of nothing. It becomes an expression without an expressor, without anything that is, anyone that is expressed, right? And this is called a klipa, a shell, because when the banana peel is created by removing the banana, right? So our goal in dealing with klipa and sitra achra cannot just be to train a nicer klipa and sitra achra. It can't just be to take an I am and make it more refined and make it wear a top hat and make it have a better British accent. That is not the goal with the klipa and sitra achra. We have to attach the peel to the banana somehow. We have to remind this thing that has become separate of its own true identity, which is that it's a manifestation of holiness, right? We have to take the thing that has become separate and return it to being an expression of God. And no matter how nice you make something that is fundamentally separate, no matter if you say, I am a nice person, or I am a person who helps little old ladies across the street, or I am an altruist, right? None of these statements deals with the fundamental issue of I am. And that is, to the Alter Rebbe, the fundamental issue. Either you are God saying I am, or you are not. Those are the two categories. Either you are the statement, the expression of God, or you are something else. And that is the category of Sitra Achra. We said in chapter 6 that most of our reality down here in the physical universe is a world of Klippa and Sitra Achra. This is the reality in which we live. This is the reality where our animal soul, which as we're about to say in chapter 7, also remind ourselves, our animal soul also comes from the Klippa and Sitra Achra. This is the reality that we inhabit. When we go out into the world and we see, oh look, there's a table. The table does not appear to be an expression of God. It doesn't appear to be an expression of anything. In fact, its existence seems perfectly neutral. It seems to be here just because it's here, right? It takes up space in time and space. It doesn't even have a justification for why it's here. It can just be sitting here. We don't even know how it physically got here, right? That is an object of Klippa and Sitra Achra. The world is a world that covers over the fact that it is even an expression, and nowhere more than in the physical per se. The physical per se, just the fact that something physically just is, right, is a denial just through existing. It's a denial of godliness, right? It's a denial that there is only God and his infinite self-expression, his infinite self. And so, you really come out of chapter 6 with really there's good things, and then there's things that are in denial of God. And those are really your two choices. And the world is mostly a denial of God, right? You have to keep remembering that when we say a denial of God, we mean existentially, right? We don't mean intentionally. We don't say someone says I'm an atheist or God does not exist. That's not what we mean, right? We mean even something just existing is a denial of God. Neutral existence, so to speak, denies God because neutral existence is not true. All existence is divine. All existence is an expression of God. All existence is personal to God, right? The fact that the universe can even seem impersonal, can even seem to just exist, right, is a indication that our universe is full of Klippa and Sitra Achra. To the Alter Rebbe. This is how the Alter Rebbe sees the world. Now in chapter 7, we're going to add a slight complication, a slight wrinkle to this whole picture. The wrinkle is that the three impure klippas that we've been discussing, which the Alter Rebbe ends chapter 6 saying they have no good in them whatsoever, right? Which means there's no good expressed in them. All the good within them, all the divine within them, their true nature is in exile within them, is the language of the Alter Rebbe, is totally locked up and inaccessible within them, right? That those are not the only type of klippa. There's another type of klippa that we encounter every single day. In chapter 7, we're going to introduce this new category, and that's how chapter 7 opens. I do want to point out one other important thing that we spoke about in chapter 6, which is that the Torah's laws do have a metaphysical ground, right? In other words, we said in chapter 6 that when the Torah says something is forbidden, it's because it's from the impure klippas. It's because it's from something that is in denial of God in an irreparable way, right? So in other words, a Jew is not supposed to get involved. A Jew is not supposed to eat a cheeseburger, right? Because a cheeseburger is mixture of milk and meat. The Torah is describing when the Torah forbids something, that means this is something that comes from the klippa. This is something of the shell or of the other side, which is in opposition to holiness. This is what you could call the seichel of the Torah, the rational system of the Torah. Is the rational system of the Torah the same as the rational system of the world? In other words, we normally say in this class, we're very radical in this class on the point that the Torah's laws have no rational explanation. We're radical about it because Chassidus is radical about it, right? There is no ultimate rational explanation for the laws of the Torah. There is no a rational system, right, in which the laws are explained to be accomplishing something. Certainly not accomplishing human betterment and self-perfection and many of the other ways that the mitzvahs have been explained, the commandments have been explained. So when I say that the mitzvahs correspond to a metaphysical reality, right, the mitzvahs that tell you thou shalt not eat a cheeseburger, right, thou shalt not wear shatnez, right, those commandments, mixtures of wool and linen, those commandments, right, are describing a metaphysical reality. So doesn't that in a way mean that this is an explanation of the mitzvahs? I think the question is almost self-answering, but you tell me if that's what it means. Is anyone even listening? Anyone understand what I'm saying? This doesn't get you anywhere. The Torah is not categorizing something that can be perceived in a qualitative way at all, at least by the animal soul, right? In other words, by the rational participant in human rationality, the Torah's laws have no rational content in this way. Or to put it differently, if you saw an apple that was orla and totally forbidden to eat, and an apple that was from the 5th year and totally permitted to eat, right? And you saw them sitting side by side, they could be physically and spiritually and in every sense 100% identical, and yet one is absolutely from the 3 impure klippas, you are utterly forbidden to eat it. It cannot be redeemed in the way, as we're going to discuss this soon in Tanya, in the way that other food can be redeemed. It cannot be redeemed, and this is the holiness within it brought out of exile. The one apple no, but the other apple yes. And there is no way to make this distinction except through Torah. So in other words, what we're saying is, yes, the Torah has a system, and it has a rational system, because all systems are rational, but the system that the Torah has is not a system that intersects with human rational systems. It's some other system, right? With a basis that, and if you ask why is the one apple forbidden and the other apple not forbidden, it's the same question as asking why is this apple from the klippa, from the shalosh klippas atmeis, and this apple from klippas nega, right? Why is this one forbidden and this one permitted, right? And the answer is the Torah's commandments are not ultimately rational. That's the answer. Yes. So in other words, you see that we're kind of making a lateral explanation of the Torah's mitzvahs. We're enriching our appreciation of what the Torah's law of Orla means, that you're not allowed to eat from the fruit tree in the first 3 years, right? We're expanding on that law, right? But we are not in any way rationalizing that law. I just wanted to point that out. I see, in case everyone was very concerned about it, I can tell everyone was very concerned. Okay, let's start chapter 7. Perek Zayin, chapter 7. We are on page Yud Aleph. You can't miss it. Page Yud Aleph in the Hebrew, 26 in the English. You literally cannot miss it. Chapter 7, Perek Zayin. Zok the Heilige Tanya, the Holy Tanya says, the Alter Rebbe writes, Perek Zayin Ach. Chapter 7, however. That's how chapter 7 starts. Chapter 7 starts, however, as they translate here, on the other hand. Right? We finished chapter 6 discussing the 3 impure klippas. Chapter 7 begins, on the other hand. There is something else to add to this picture. That's the on the other hand or however. What are we going to add? I have to say it at the beginning because I'm not even sure we're going to get to the end of the sentence where the Alter Rebbe names it himself in tonight's class. So let me tell you at the beginning what the however is, just in case we don't get there tonight, right? Well, God willing, by next week we'll get thoroughly into the topic, right? But tonight, the Alter Rebbe is going to say there is another category of klippa. In the previous chapter, we talked about the 3 impure klippas, the 3 impure shells, which correspond to things that are forbidden by the Torah, right? In chapter 4 and chapter 5, we spoke about holiness, the things that are commanded by the Torah, the mitzvahs and the Torah that the godly soul participates in, right? As far as we're concerned so far, by the way, and this is, as we're going to see, obviously this is not the case, as we're going to learn. But if we were learning Tanya for the first time, as far as we know until this point, the godly soul and the animal soul do different things. You may note, right? In other words, if this was your first time learning Tanya, you would say that godly soul, when I do a commandment, it's the godly soul that does it, right? When I eat a cheeseburger, it's the animal soul that does it, right? And the two, they both live in me, but they both do different things, right? In other words, you can't make the godly soul do a transgression, and you can't make the animal soul do a mitzvah. So far in Tanya, you could come away with that impression, even though that's not correct, right? You could come away with that impression so far. In other words, I'm just making a note of the way the Alter Rebbe learns this, that the Alter Rebbe keeps the souls separate until it's time to bring them together. You understand? I'm just pointing out to you the structure of the Tanya. These chapters, the chapters that were about the godly soul didn't mention the animal soul at all when we talked about mitzvahs, right? And doing fulfilling mitzvahs, wrapping tefillin was a godly soul issue. Here we're talking about eating cheeseburgers, an animal soul issue, right? Later, we're going to see that these two share a very, very small space, right? They're not so separate like that, but we haven't got there yet, right? So in this chapter, we're generally speaking about the animal soul. I just want to point out that we've already spoken about Kedusha. We already spoke about Torah and mitzvahs in the context of the godly soul, right? We already spoke about those things that are holy. The animal soul. So we spoke about that which is commanded, which is in chapter 4 and chapter 5, and we've spoken about that which is forbidden, which is in chapter 6. However, in Jewish law, we know there is a third category, right? Some would say a minuscule category, but there is a third category. It's not true. It's not so minuscule. There is a third category which is called klippas noiga. Klippas noiga means the klippa that is translucent. Noiga means light. Yeah. Light, illumination, yeah. Klippas noiga means the klippa that is translucent, that you can see light through. It's the illuminated, pardon? Translucent is the English word. Translucent means light comes through, but you can't really see through it clearly. It's the English word, translucent, right? Like a frosted window. You can't see through. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sort of like those windows, right? Like a frosted window. The light comes in, but you can't see anything through them, right? So you have the translucent klippa, right? It's the klippa that light can come through. Why is this important? Why is this the name? Let's put it that way. It's the name because we just finished saying in chapter 6 that klipa has no good in it at all, which corresponds to being totally dark. It does have light in it, in fact, as we explained in chapter 6. There's no such thing as anything which doesn't have any good at all, because as we keep saying, there is no such thing as neutral existence, right? If it doesn't have any good, it doesn't exist, right? It can't be if it doesn't have any good, because all things that are expressions of godliness, but the good within it is not felt and not revealed in any way. It is totally in exile within it. It is as if it's not there for all intents, and we shouldn't say for all, for most, the vast majority of intents and purposes, it's as if the light is not there. Here we have another category. The klipas nega is the middle category. It's not holiness, it's not light, but it's, in other words, in the division of holy and not holy, it's on the not holy side. It's a klipa. Its name is klipa, right? It's not holiness. However, there are some things whose not holiness is a very, whose not holiness is an easily fixable issue. Let's put it that way. In other words, you can shine light through this klipa. You can make this klipa. It's very easy to put this peel back on the banana. Some peels are almost impossible to put back on the banana. This peel, it's actually relatively easy to put back on the banana. It's called klipas nega, and as we're going to see, as Alter Rebbe is about to describe, this is the category of things that the Torah says is permitted. You're not commanded to do it, like it's not holy, like the mitzvahs and the Torah that we discussed in chapter 4 and chapter 5. It's not a totally forbidden thing to get involved with, and we'll discuss why this distinction exists soon. But it's not something to not get involved with at all, like we said in chapter 6, like a cheeseburger, right, or orla, or shatnez, right, which are banned from using in certain ways. It's in the middle. It's something called mutar, which we're going to discuss what that word, and we're going to discuss the etymology of that word and a Hasidic understanding, all coming up soon. That's what we're going to discuss. When Alter Rebbe says, however, right, there's an additional category. The additional category is what we call klipas nega, the translucent klipa, and it's all those things that the Torah relates to as merely permitted, right? The best example is eating and drinking kosher food. Yeah, that's the classic example. It's the example that Alter Rebbe is going to use. Eating and drinking kosher food is not a mitzvah most of the time, right? On a weekday, etc. Sometimes there's a mitzvah, but most of the time it's not a mitzvah. If you have if you eat an egg on a prosta mitzvah, as we say, on a regular mundane Wednesday, yeah. You're not commanded to do so. You're not forbidden to do so. It's a kosher egg, right? You're not commanded to do so. You're not forbidden. It's neutral, so to speak. It's neutral in terms of how you relate to it in command of the Torah, is how it's neutral. This neutral realm is called klipas nega. These things, the soul of these things is the translucent klipa. We have already, back in chapter 1, made a qualitative distinction between the different types of klipa. You probably don't remember it, so I will remind you. We did this when discussing the difference between the Jew and the idolater, right? Because as we're going to say, the Jew's animal soul comes from klipas nega, comes from the translucent klipa, as opposed to what we said in the previous chapter, that the idolater's soul comes from the shalosh klipas atameis, the three impure klipas totally in denial of God. The Jewish animal soul, and really, I think you could argue this is the most important thing about klipas nega, is that the Jewish animal soul is an expression of klipas nega, and indeed the soul of the righteous among the nations, right? Which means that nowadays most people live in a place of klipas nega, right? Most people's soul. What are they? What is that person that you talk to on a regular basis? When you say hello to someone at the grocery store, you are talking to a being of klipas nega. Very important, right? In the first chapter, we said, what's klipas nega? Klipas nega is I am. Right? That's klipas nega. We didn't call it that in the first chapter because we were trying to learn everything in its place, right? But klipas, well, we did actually call it, the Alter Rebbe called it. I just don't know if we emphasized the distinction so much. Yeah, you remember? Klipas nega is I am. Holiness is God saying I am. Yeah? Klipas nega is the idea of each thing's own self saying I am. What's Shalosh Klippas HaTmeis? What's the three impure klippas?
What are they?
In this context, if holiness is God saying I am, and the klippas nega, the middle klippa, the neutral klippa, is the creation saying I am, what's the three impure klippas?
I'm saying I am.
No, I'm saying I am is klippas nega. What's the three impure klippas? The three impure klippas is only I, or with no am. With no am. I am, is the interesting state of the klippas nega. Why? Why did I phrase it that way? This is my own original phrasing, by the way. So if it's terrible and it all falls apart, it's my fault, by the way. Why do we put it that way? Why do I put it that way? Because to be, right, so to speak, to exist, neutral existence is a klippas nega issue. Neutral existence is klippas nega, so to speak. Even though no existence is neutral, right? In other words, either it's God saying I am or it's something else saying I am. Those are the only two options, right? There's no neutrality, right? That's the distinction. You can't have, no matter how nice an I am you have, if it's not God saying it, it's not holy, right? Which is true, first of all. So that distinction works. And then am, this idea of neutrality, right, is the core of what makes klippas nega, right? As we're going to learn, going through into chapter 8, which chapter 8 is about how daily life is a field of landmines as far as klippa and sitra achra go, right? Daily life is very non-holy by default, as we're going to learn in chapter 8, right? But making it a lot of people's not favorite chapter of Tanya, let's put it that way. But the neutral existence is a klippas nega issue, right? In other words, as we're going to learn going forward, klippas nega means you can take it and you can make it holy or not holy. A soul can do that, right? In other words, a person, if you take a food that's kosher, you eat it for the right reason, holiness. You eat it for the wrong reason, three impure klippas, right? This is just the basics that we're going to learn. So what klippas nega has that the other two don't have, at least not naturally, is a certain type of neutrality, right? It's an I am, and it's waiting for you to say, right, I am good, I am bad, I am godly, I am in denial of God. It remains an I am. Right? It remains an I am until it becomes holy, right? Once you make it holy, then it becomes an extension of God saying I am, which is the true nature of everything. I understand this is a lot, right? The inner true nature of everything, the divine spark, is the divine vitality, right? And that divine vitality is God saying I am within everything. Yeah? So you take the klippa, and once you make it holy, it's God saying I am. Before you make it holy, even if it's a very nice I am, whenever it's not holy, right? At any point it's not holy, it's still its own I am, right? You could be I am very refined, I am a servant of God, even you could say, but still a klippa. Still a separate thing from holiness, right? The three impure klippas cannot be used this way. The three impure klippas have no neutrality about them at all. It's not I am where the end of the sentence is left neutral, where you could say, I am holy, I am in denial of God, right? The three impure klippas is only I, right? It's either I without am, or it's only I, which is the worst, right? As you go to lower and lower levels, right? In other words, there is no room to say, there is no room for God to exist in the three impure klippas, and that's really the difference. The real difference is that the three impure klippas, aside from very unusual situations, which we discuss later in Tanya, the three impure klippas are not accessible to be made godly. You can't take them and say, I am godly. You can't refine them to the point where they become an expression of godliness, or are open to becoming an expression of godliness. They're basically closed. They're much more locked down, which is actually locked down is a paraphrase of the word asur, is a paraphrase of the word forbidden, whereas the openness of klipos nega is a paraphrase of the word mutar. So I'm just explaining to you how I get this very simple paradigm, which I use to remember them and to contextualize them, of holiness is God saying I am, Klippas Nega is I am, three impure klippas is only I. Is only I. There's no am. There's no openness. There's no existential openness, right? I'm not even, the three impure klippas aren't even open to the concept of neutral existence, right? They say, no, all things are grounded in me. There's no room for true neutral existence. There's no even room. There's no room for God to exist like I exist. That's the three impure klippas, right? The klippas nega is neutral. Klippas nega is, okay, I exist, but maybe God exists also, right? That's a klippas nega vibe, for lack of a better term. Okay, let's read what the Alter Rebbe says. Enough of my speech making. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe, Perek Zayin Ach, chapter 7. However, nefesh hachiyunis habahamesh b'Yisrael, the vitalizing animal soul in Israel, shemitzad haklipa hamiluveshes bedam ha'adam kanal, that exists, how do they put it, which is derived from the aspect of klipa that is enclosed in the human blood, canal, as we said earlier in chapter 1. This should ring a bell, right? In chapter 1 we said the first soul of the Jew is the vital soul, right? Is the soul that gives life to the body. How does it give life to the body? By being enclosed in the blood, right? Which we explained there back in chapter 1, that the animal soul is spiritual, and now we know to say, but it's not godly. A very important category, by the way. People get very easily confused when they start being spiritual. You start being spiritual, all of a sudden you think you're godly. No. The animal soul is spiritual inherently. You are already spiritual. You were spiritual before you knew you were spiritual, right? You are always spiritual. You're a spiritual being. The spiritual being is the one who only ever does what they want and never truly becomes godly in any way. That's a spiritual being, yeah? Spiritual and godly is the first, is an important distinction. Nothing to do with one another fundamentally, right? Now, I'm being too glib because, in fact, it's not really the case. The truth is that in a case where you're dealing with something that's very physical, right, usually the more spiritual side in a more refined way is in a one sense moving closer to God. But that's all like asterisks on this point for a different time, and it's a different Chassidus class on a different topic, a different mimer. But Chassidus will discusses that at length. That's a different topic, right? But fundamentally what we're saying here is also true. What we're saying here is true, that spiritual is not godly. The animal soul is spiritual. It's not physical. The animal soul. What? That's very true. The only question is it actually spiritual? That's a different story. But the animal soul, right? The animal soul is spiritual, but not godly, right? It's spiritual, but it's a klippa. It says I am. It's not an expression of God, yeah? And that spiritual force is what's enclosed in the blood to make the body live. And it's what leaves when, God forbid, the soul departs and the person passes away. That's what departs, right? Is the animal soul. The animal soul is what gives life to the body. Here, by the way, I think in the first chapter, if I recall correctly, I wish I remembered more perfectly, you may want to check me on this, but if I recall correctly, in the first chapter, I don't think we even call it the animal soul. I think here is the first time where we say that soul we were talking about there is what's called the animal soul. And in typical Chabad parlance, we always call it the animal soul, right? But so here's actually where the connection is drawn. That soul, which is the vivifying soul, the one that gives life, is the animal soul, the nefesh habahamis, as we call it. I should also point out that the nefesh hachiyunis, the term the vital soul, is used elsewhere in Judaism. It's a term that's used by the Rambam and the Ran and the Sforno and other people, and it's all, this is where the Alter Rebbe is saying that concept in general means the animal soul. Yeah. So if you encounter the nefesh hachiyunis, the vitalizing soul, Alter Rebbe would say, yes, that's what I was talking about. If we mean it in the same sense, that's the animal soul. Yeah. I should just note, this is not I don't think this is a mistake a lot of people make, but we should note that when we say it's the animal soul, right, we mean the human animal, right? right? Don't think that because we call it the animal soul, it's exactly like some other kind of animal, right? Like a chimp or a dog or a dolphin or something else. We mean the human animal, right? That's why a lot of contemporary teachers of Chassidus like to call it the biological soul, which really captures, I think, for us, the same sense, the same connotation of what the Alter Rebbe means by animal soul, right? It's the biological self. It's the human animal self, so to speak, right? Not a different animal. It's the human animal self. Sorry?
It's essential. That's why I call it Kiyuni. You have to have this soul. Kiyuni means you can't live without it.
Yeah, it's what gives life. It's life itself, right? Life itself, physical life on this planet is the animal soul. The animal soul is the human animal. Right. This is very important to remember, especially with a lot of the questions about Tanya. A lot of them are answered with the concept that we've touched on before, called the nefesh sichlis, which is the intellect. The intellect of the animal soul is one way of explaining the nefesh sichlis, and it's extremely important. In fact, I would argue it's impossible to understand some things in Tanya without understanding that the human animal has an intellect, and that intellect is categorically different from any other animal. Right? In other words, if you don't understand that a human being has an intellect that is categorically different from any other animal, you will not really fully understand Tanya. It's not obvious how you want to understand it, but I'm saying you'll ask questions, and then those will have answers, and then you'll ask questions on those answers, and the answer to that question will be, because the animal soul it's not just the animal soul. There's an intellect as well. Sometimes we talk about the animal soul as being much more animalistic, right? Like when we talk about its lusts and desires, right? But there is a dimension of the animal soul, which we'll touch on in chapter 8, God willing, that is a higher dimension, which is an intellectual dimension, and it's important, it's vital to understand that this intellectual dimension is not like any other animal, right? It is uniquely human, and in this way, it's almost like the most refined aspect of the klipa. It's the part of the klipa that is most open to and most in contact with the godly soul. In fact, yes, exactly. It's an intermediary of sorts, even though it's on the side of klipa, which is important to understand. It's on the side of klipa, but the intellect is a fundamental intermediary between the animal soul and the God. The animal soul, as we often call it, and the godly soul. It is the intellect is an ingredient in all of this that you can't write off. So when we say the human animal, right, you have to remember the human animal is very, very smart, different than any other animal. Yes, and when we say very smart, that means a lot of things. It's not just raw intelligence, right? It is a lot of what makes us human. In fact, I would say everything that makes us uniquely human is in the seichel of the animal soul, is in the mind of the animal soul. This is easy to remember with the same mnemonic I was telling you before of God saying, I am, and only I, right? Because if you remember, the klipas nega, right, can have a concept of an, right? It has a concept of neutral existence, right? So in other words, in its most refined form, the animal soul, which is of klipas nega, will be able to say, I am all sorts of different things. It has that openness, right? That openness is a quality of the intellect. Animals are not open in the same way, right? You argue with a dog and explain to it that it's not the center of the universe, right? Or that God exists, for example, in the way you would explain to a human being, even a very young human child, right? Totally different. Yes? Okay, just a note on the terminology animal soul. Continues the Holy Alter Rebbe in the third line. V'nafshes behemus v'chayos v'efes v'dagim toherim u'mutarim ba'achila. Also included in this category are the souls of the animals and of the domesticated animals and the wild animals and the birds and the fish, the kosher fish, all the kosher ones, u'mutarim ba'achila, that are permitted to eat. V'kiyum chayos kol hadomim v'kol hatzameach hamutar ba'achila. And also the sustenance and the vitality of all the inanimate things and all of the plants that are permitted to eat, right? So here you had the animals, we had the human with the Jewish animal soul, then you have the animals, the ones that are kosher animals, then you have the Domen, it's out of order, which is interesting. Some of the commentaries discuss why. My bottom line is that I don't really understand why it's out of order. But you have the inanimate, and then you have the plants, is the order the Alter Rebbe uses here, which is very interesting. Some want to argue that the body the bodies of the kosher animals and of the Jew, the physical bodies, their matter, are inanimate, right? Because when the soul leaves, God forbid, you see that there's an inanimate body left over. And so the inanimate is closer to the animal and to the person than the plant is. The plant is categorically different. So the inanimate is moved up. But I don't know if I really understand that explanation. That's an explanation some like to give why the order is different here. The bottom line is I don't know. Requires more investigation, requires more study. All of these things are in the category of klipas nega. They're all in the category of the permitted, right? Now, we're going to get into this more in future classes, God willing. My plan, hopefully, is to take some one or two of the Rebbe's letters on this topic, which are absolutely fascinating, literally helping us learn the Tanya, where the Rebbe goes through some interesting cases, because it's not so clear from the Tanya. Like, it sounds clear, but then you get to complicated cases, right? Like chametz that was totally forbidden on Pesach, but then was totally permitted. And then you have the soul interactions, right? It's interesting because bacon you're not allowed to eat. You're allowed to sell as a Jew, but you're not allowed to eat it, right? It's what we call mutar b'hana, asur b'achila. You're permitted to benefit. You're just forbidden to eat, right? You can have a pigskin yarmulke, as some rabbis like to joke, and it's all good, right? The cheeseburger, on the other hand, you cannot have as an observant Jew a restaurant that sells cheeseburgers, because cheeseburgers are asur b'hana, not just b'achila. They're forbidden in benefiting, not just in eating. The Rebbe has beautiful and enlightening letters where the Rebbe goes through the fine gradations here to explain how it works, right? Which is more of it's either later in this chapter or chapter 8, God willing, we'll God willing study the Rebbe's letter on this a letter or two on this matter, to try and get into the nitty gritty, which I think is fascinating, because the Rebbe has a thorough and technical understanding of these matters and how they work, right? Of these soul matters have a thorough explanation. Anyway, it's interesting to note that if you look, we've mentioned this in the previous class, but you can see it here again, that when we say the inanimate matter, right, the inanimate objects, we don't say that is permitted. We just say and the inanimate is all in the category of klipas nega, is all in the category of the permitted, because if you actually look, you will see that there is no inanimate matter, according to the Torah, that is inherently forbidden. Right? Inanimate matter becomes forbidden through action, right? Like, for example, if an idolater worships a brick, right? For example, which is an example used in the Talmud, if an idolater worships a brick, then you have an issue, right? It can become forbidden. But fundamentally, the way God made the world, interestingly, there are some plants that are forbidden to Jews to eat, right? For example, there are certainly animals that are forbidden to deal with in different ways. But inanimate objects are fundamentally permitted in Torah, which is just an interesting thing to note. And that's why the Alter Rebbe doesn't say all of the permitted inanimate objects. He says all the inanimate objects inherently are, by nature of klipas nega, are in the realm of the permitted, which, by the way, I would just like to point out that points to the idea of the neutrality of the existence of klipas nega. Right? Because everything else on the list is made of, in body at least, is made of matter, and the matter goes whichever way the thing goes. Just note, right? In other words, you could argue, right, if a physicist was learning Tanya, you take a bunch of molecules and you put them together into a cheeseburger, those molecules can be part of and become shalosh klipas atmeis. But if you take molecules and you make them into a kosher meal, or even better, if you make them into a pair of tefillin or something like that, they can even become holiness and an expression of holiness. Matter is neutral. So I'm just saying, it's interesting because the whole idea of klipas nega, again, is this sort of spiritual no man's land, is this spiritual neutrality of sorts, even though it's klipa, right? Where it can be easily go either way. And you see this even in matter itself. Matter's nature is to acquire form, you would say in philosophy. Matter's nature is to go according to the form that it acquires. However you arrange it, that's what it becomes. I'm just saying. Whereas matter inherently is of no valence. It's just stuff, right? Matter is just stuff. So how could you say whether it's holy or not holy? Understand? Right? It's all just klipas nega. It's an existential denial of God, right? But it's not forbidden by the Torah. or commanded by the Torah. It's just stuff. Just stuff corresponds to matter. Yeah, corresponds to domain, the inanimate.
It's fair to say it's because it doesn't have any ratzon.
Maybe, yeah, to grow. You could say it's complicated. It's even if you want to say unconscious ratzon, an interesting idea. Possibly. We do say that the core of the animal soul is ratzon. So maybe you could extend that even to plants. I'm not sure. It's an interesting idea. Maybe, but in the way that a plant has a ratzon, I think you would say that matter has a ratzon. So maybe you could even go deeper and say that matter's ratzon is just different. Matter's ratzon is just to take up time and space or whatever it is, right? You know what I mean? And to be bound to other matter, to relate to other matter, however it is. It's very interesting. Yeah, it's worth a thought, worth a ponder. Okay. I just want to point out that by saying this, the Alter Rebbe has completed the exhaustive categorization of all things that exist, by the way. That's it. That's the full list. Chapters 4 and 5, you had things that are holy. In chapter 6, you had things that are forbidden, the klipa that is forbidden. And here you have the klipa of the permitted. There is nothing left over. This is the whole, and we've included the actions and behaviors, which were Asher Loila Hashem Hema, which we included in the previous chapter, right? The actions, the thought, speech, and action of the animal soul not directed towards God, we said in the previous chapter. Basically, we've now encompassed all things that exist. Just note, it's so telling, to me anyway, I think, it's so telling how the Alter Rebbe did it. The Alter Rebbe did it through souls. There is no discussion of the world, really, right? All discussion is an add-on to the discussion of the soul, right? Alter Rebbe says the soul is this, and all of these things that the soul relates to, right, and relates to in this way, right, are then that's how we categorize the whole universe. The whole universe is categorized relative to the levushim, coming after to and adjacent to and external to the garments of the soul. Soul first. It's a soul first work. The work is oriented. We start with the soul and the inmost and the most real, and then we go outward. And you can also note, it's interesting, I think, that the chapters on Klippa are much more focused on the external world than the chapter on Kedusha. The chapter on Kedusha, the external world was barely in passing, right? We talk about how the tefillin need leather and things like that. Here is much more thorough, which is interesting, and it's the reason why. There's multiple reasons you could say why, but the simple reason why is because the whole world is full of Klippa, right? That's what most things are, and therefore it gets the most of the discussion. But even though it's what most things are, right, the Alter Rebbe still discusses it from the inside out, not from the outside in. In other words, you wouldn't say you don't start with a view of the whole universe and then zero in on the human being, on the Jew, right? It's the opposite. The whole universe is just the thing that your soul interacts with. That's all. There's no, in other words, I'm going to say that everything is Klippa and Sitra Achra, but even already the Alter Rebbe said, but what is everything? Everything is just what your soul interacts with. In other words, in my opinion, this is again just my opinion, the very structure of Tanya tells you not to get intimidated. Right? The very structure of the book is trying to encourage you. Yeah, don't get intimidated. You first. You come first. You're the most real thing in this soul and in this soul. But you first, the human being first, right? The world, okay, there's a world. The world has to do with how you interact with in your levushim, in your garments, right? But to think that you are a principle of the world, to think that you arise from the world or some small thing in a vast world full of klippas, right? That's not the case. That's not the case. Sorry? Nezer Habriya. You have to translate for us who don't speak Hebrew, me included.
Why? It's
the diadem. Yeah. The crown, the pinnacle, the acme of creation. So that's what acme means, by the way, when it's not written on the side of the acme. You know what it says on the side of the anvil that crushes Wile E. Coyote? That's what acme means. Acme means the nezer. Yeah, and the nezer. That's what it means. The anvil should say nezer on the side. So the the whole structure of the Tanya is a pnimius structure, is an inner structure, right? I just feel, here's where the class turns into Fabrengen. I feel that Chassidus, sometimes we package it in a way where we say the world, the world, the world, the world, the world. It's about the world is a better place, the world, the world, the world. I'm just pointing out to you that in the Alter Rebbe's Tanya, right, there's a danger in saying the world, the world, the world, right? The danger is that if you start with the world and the world comes first, and you don't start with the neshama, you don't start with soul, right? You can get it all backwards. You can start believing that the soul is a small thing in a vast world, that the soul comes from the world, God forbid, right? That the soul is just one part of the world, God forbid, right? This is all wrong. You have to have before you start saying the world, the world, the world, the Alter Rebbe will say the world, the world, the world later in Tanya. Before you get to the world, the world, the world, you have to have your head screwed on straight, right? Your head screwed on straight is you start with the neshama first. Soul is what's most real. Soul is the core reality. The world is what you do with your levushim, right? You have these garments, which are these sort of distant, parochial sort of, like on the far reaches of your empire as a soul. You have these things which relate externally, called thought, speech, and action, right? And thought, speech, and action, okay, so some of the things that they relate with externally are the whole infinite universe first, full of things, right? But if you start with the soul, then the infinite universe full of things will always be small, right? You can't get intimidated, right? The intimidation starts when you start believing that the world is more real than you are, right? I'm just pointing out to you that in the very structure of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says the opposite. The Alter Rebbe, soul first. Soul comes first. You come first. The world is what you interact with externally, and for a reason. For a reason. It doesn't have to be that way, right? It's not inherently that way, as we're going to see, right? You're here to do a job, right? But a person who starts believing that their job is their measure of their worth and their whole existence, right? It's very, very bad. In fact, it can even prevent them from doing their job. Yes? Okay. Continuing on. V'chein kiyum, I'm now 5 lines in. V'chein kiyum v'chayus kol ha'ma'aser dibur machshava b'inyanei elam hazeh she'en ben tzad Yisrael le'sheresh v'le'anav mishas ha'mitzvos le'saseh. So too the sustenance and vitality of every action, speech, and thought in worldly matters that do not have any aspect of the forbidden, not in a sheresh and not in an anaf, not in a root and not in a branch, meaning to say there is nothing forbidden about them whatsoever, mishasa mitzvahs leisaseh, in the 365 negative commandments, va'anfeyan, and their branches, the araisa v'the both the Torah law and the rabbinical law. The Rebbe, I believe in those letters, talks about rabbinical law, very interesting. It is merely that they are not for the sake of heaven. Here you have a definition of Kedusha again. For the sake of heaven means expressing God. They are literally a continuation of God's will. So things that are not a continuation of God's will, things that are not an expression of Him, they are merely the will and the desire and the lust of the body. This is klipas nega. This is the neutral category, right? If there's anything about it that's forbidden, it becomes the 3 impure klippas. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The middle road, the neutral category is for those things that are not forbidden in any way by the Torah. They're also not commanded by the Torah. They're the neutral ground, yes? A person has to live. The Rebbe is in many sichas. I just want to introduce these terms to you. The Rebbe has many sichas about the concept of all of your actions should be for the sake of heaven, and you should know Him in all of your ways. The Rebbe has many talks about the 2 different levels. Which is the deeper level? Which is the higher level? You have all your behavior should be for the sake of heaven, and in all of your ways know Him. Is the higher one. Why? Because actions for the sake of heaven could still be not in themselves about God, right? Means, no, the thing itself is about God. It's a subtle distinction, and the Rebbe has beautiful talks elaborating on the difference in different contexts, in different ways, between these 2 levels. Right. Yeah, that's connected. So you're supposed to know God even in the neutral things. If you take something that's permitted and you use it for divine purpose, it becomes holy, right? It becomes a commandment of the Torah. And by the way, I should point out that this is not a Hasidic concept. This is a concept found in Halacha. You can look at Torah Shulchan Aruch. I even have the chapter for you. I think Reish Lamed Aleph. In Siman Reish Lamed Aleph of Torah Shulchan Aruch, you can go look in the Jewish Code of Law, where it says that even a person's health, right, and even a person's eating and drinking, it's a Chassidish Shulchan Aruch. Some of us think some things are only from Chassidus that are actually literally Jewish law. Jewish law says if a person eats and drinks, even if they're hungry and thirsty, right, they should do it for the sake of heaven, not for the sake of just fulfilling their physical need, right? What's for the sake of heaven? The Alter Rebbe is going to explain later that for the sake of heaven means you're going to use the energy to serve God, right? This is your intention of eating, right? You're doing something now with intention. You're not just eating because you want to, right? Which could be klipas nega, could be shalosh klipas atmeis. We'll talk about that in a second. You're eating with intention because this is going to give me the energy I need to do what God needs me to do. That food can then be elevated, as we're going to discuss, right? That could make it holy. If a person eats out of just to eat, right? If a person eats just because they are gluttonous, right? That's called shalosh klipas hatmeis. That's called the 3 impure klipas. The middle level, right? The neutral level, so to speak, is the idea of food, of the food itself, right? How does it exist before you eat it and choose which way it goes, right? Is this middle category. Okay. As we're going to see, what's a category of klipas nega? The Alter Rebbe continues. The Alter Rebbe says, "The afilu hu tzarich gufa kiyuma v'chayusay mamash." Even if this food, right, is for the needs. Let's say you're eating the food, right? It's only for the needs of the body, and that it should live. Kiyuma v'chayusay, its existence and its vitality, mamash, literally just to live, right? You're eating only to live. But it's not about God, right? In order to serve God with your body, right? That's not why you're eating it. You're eating it just to stay alive. This is no better. Thought, speech, and action like this is no better than the nefesh chiyunis abahamis, than the animal soul ba'atzma itself, than the animal soul itself. In other words, this is no better than klipas nega, right? It's no better than klipas nega. It could be worse. It's no better, right? And in fact, later in Tanya, it's implied that it is worse. Later in Tanya, it says that if a person involves themselves with just by eating, right, just by eating to stay alive, the person can degrade the animal soul, can lower the animal soul over time, right, through involvement with the physical and things like that. That's a separate issue. That's not really for here. We're saying, so what are we saying here really? We're saying survival, which is not surprising. Survival is a concern of the animal soul, right? The biological soul is the soul that is concerned with survival. So even if you say, if I don't eat it, I'm going to die, right? Which is quite possible, right? And that's, even if that's true, and you eat it in order not to die, that's still only an animal soul thing. Not dying is a self-perpetuating thing, right? Is eating healthy food in order not to die bad?
No.
And yes. It's no and yes. It's bad in the Alter Rebbe's definition of bad, as I keep telling you, right? You have to get used to the way the Alter Rebbe sees the world. It's bad. There are worse things. Being a glutton is worse. Being a glutton is literally shalosh klipas atmeis, right? Eating for no reason except to eat, right? Is the lowest, right? Here it's closer to a neutral area, right? It's mere self-perpetuation. If you don't eat, you're gonna die, right? However, it's not holiness, right? So by the definition of not holiness, and remember, the goal of the Tanya is holiness. The goal of the goal is soul, as some say. The goal of the Tanya is connecting to the godly soul, revealing the godly soul, becoming a godly soul person, right? Transforming the nature of the animal soul that it should become more godly, right? And godliness and holiness is the opposite of klipa. You can only have one, can't have both, right? So if in the eyes of the goal of Tanya, yes, there is only holiness. Neutrality, mere survival is bad. Survival is not good enough. Survival is the opposite of godliness. You're perpetuating what? No, if it's for the sake of God, then it's for the sake of God. We mean regular, like every animal on earth does every day, right? So regular survival is not for the sake of God, and therefore it's not good enough. It's not holy, right? On the other hand, is it bad? Does it make you a bad person? Should we lock the people up in prison? Should we look down on them from the end of our nose? Ooh, survival, disgusting? Obviously not, right? In other words, you have to understand what's good and what's bad to the Alter Rebbe. Why is the Alter Rebbe such a radical to say that survival is bad? Because this is the way you attach yourself to God, right? We're not here for survival. We're reading Tanya because we have the question, or we want to have the question, or we want to have the question, right? How do I connect to God? If you want to connect to God, I'm going to tell you the truth. Survival is not it. Survival is not good enough. Being a better you is not good enough. Perpetuating yourself is not good enough. God is something else. God is something else. And we'll talk about God and holiness, right? How to connect to God. But you have to know there's a line there. Klipas nega is still klipa. Just because the Torah doesn't forbid it, right, doesn't mean that you're doing it for the sake of heaven, right? You have to choose. You have to choose. This is why there's a famous Hayom which says, I believe from Likud Diburim, famous Hayom which says that the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe would say, and they would spend years internalizing this simple teaching, right? What's forbidden is forbidden, and what's permitted is not necessary, right? Therefore, what's left is holiness. That's Tanya, right? You could say that's a paraphrase of chapter 7 of Tanya. The Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe would say, if it's forbidden, it's forbidden. So obviously it's forbidden, right? If it's permitted, I don't need it, right? What's permitted? What do I need permitted for in my life, right? I want to do holiness. I want to be involved with God, right? That is the Alter Rebbe's, that message pervades these chapters of Tanya. That is the Alter Rebbe's worldview. The Alter Rebbe's worldview, the goal, if you wanted to turn this chapter into Avodah, into a service of God, that would be the summary. You have to start looking at the permitted as not good enough. You have to start looking at the permitted as, why do I need this in my life? You examine each thing in your life, like, what's the name of that, there's the Japanese lady who does the house cleaning. You know what I'm talking about? Where she says you're supposed to pick up every object. She's about throwing things away, right? You have to pick up every object that you own and say, does this spark a joy? And if the answer is no, you have to throw it out. Marie Kondo, I think is her name. Kondo. By the way, there was a news story about her recently that she says since she has 3 kids, she doesn't keep the house clean anymore, by the way. But anyway, that's a different story. But a lot of parents read the story and were very happy. Were said, this is our comeuppance, right? And she saw little Miss Tushu is keeping the house clean, right? I'll see what you're like when you have kids. And it turns out even she, with 3 kids, can't keep the house clean. But anyway, the Chassidim of that was a major departure. The Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe looked at the permitted and said, is this really necessary? Right? And the answer is there is no necessary things that are permitted. There are no necessary things that are permitted, right? Survival in Judaism is something to be consecrated, right? You eat because God wants you to be here in this world and to fulfill his mission, right? You go to work for the same reason. And so too, everything else that we do. This is one of the revolutionary teachings of the Alter Rebbe, that what is permitted is not necessary. Yeah. V'hakol kasher l'kol. We'll just read it. We'll explain it next week, God willing. Hakol kasher l'kol nishba v'nimshach medega sheni shebeklipas v'sitra achra. All of these things are nishba. They flow from v'nimshach. They get their flow from and are drawn forth from the second level in klipa and sitra achra. She klipa revius, which is the fourth klipa, hanikres klipas nega, which is called klipas nega, the translucent klipa, which in Torah law is the realm of the permitted. God willing, to be continued next time.